Subcommittee on Oversight and Accountability and Subcommittee on Global Health, Global Human Rights, and International Organizations will come to order. The purpose of this hearing is to examine the United Nations Relief and Works Agency's priorities and operations as it pertains to the United States Foreign Assistance Standards. And I now recognize myself for an opening statement. This hearing is entitled UNRWA Exposed, Examining the Agency's Mission and Failures. This hearing will take a closer look into the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees, or UNRWA, and address serious concerns raised regarding the UN agency and its policies funded by the American taxpayer. The world was horrified when the Hamas terrorists, with the support of other Palestinian men, women, and children, raided houses, kibbutz, schools, concerts, and kindergartens to kill, capture, rape, or torture any Jew that they could find on October 7th. As the dust settles, and as we put together the pieces of what enabled such barbaric atrocities, we are getting a picture of failed UN policies that have been accumulating for the last 7 decades in the Gaza Strip. I want to pause for a moment and say that thankfully, at least in part, it appears that the Biden administration has realized the folly of funding UNRWA. I'm concerned the administration is playing a shell game with us, however. While the Biden administration announced on January 26th that it would return to President Trump's policy of not funding UNRWA for a period of time, it does appear as though they may have waited to make this announcement until after they allowed for a disbursement of tens of millions of dollars to go out to UNRWA on or before January 24th. And if that's the case, it should be considered outrageous. Let me be clear that we are examining UNRWA because the agency directly and indirectly supported Hamas and other terrorist organizations in multiple different ways. First of all, UNRWA takes the talking points from Hamas and broadcasts them to the world. When all of the so-called journalists took the lie that Israel bombed the Al-Ali hospital, UNRWA, an official UN agency, pulled the casualty number from the Hamas-run Gaza Health Ministry. In fact, to this day, UNRWA continues to parrot the numbers put out by the Hamas affiliates without taking a single grain of salt on who puts them out in the first place. Second, wherever you see UNRWA facilities, including schools in Gaza, you are almost guaranteed to find tunnels, rocket launchers, and weapon storages. During Israel's incursion into Gaza, Israel Defense Forces uncovered a variety of rifles and ammunition hidden underneath UNRWA institutions. If you think those are just a coincidence, this brings me to another point. UNRWA employees are actively involved in calling to wipe out the only Jewish homeland on earth. We've seen footage and evidence of UNRWA teachers and staff praising and celebrating the October 7th attack on social media, referring to the attack as an unforgettable, glorious morning and a splendid sight. We read reports that at least 12 UNRWA employees directly participated in the attack. Let me say that one more time. We read reports that at least 12 UNRWA employees directly participated in the attack. In fact, intelligence reports indicate that as many as 10% of UNRWA workers have direct links to Hamas and Palestinian Islamic jihadists. While all of these are taking place, what does UNRWA not do? You can go to UNRWA's very active X, formerly known as Twitter, and find little to no mention of Hamas. Not a single word of Hamas stealing U.S. taxpayer-funded food, medicine, or fuel. Not a single statement to condemn Hamas for the hostages it continues to hold. Not a single mention of how Hamas has created the devastating situation for the people of Gaza. It is clear that UNRWA would never use its platform to speak out against Hamas because it is in cahoots with Hamas. At this point, you could say that when UNRWA schools are not teaching the Palestinian children to hate Jews, These schools are used to hide and fire rockets at Israeli civilians, all using our tax dollars. Make no mistake, the attacks on October 7th did not happen in a vacuum. The sickness on display from UNRWA is rooted in something deeper within its structure and mission. It's rooted in the double standard the world applies for them, from their definition of refugee to the hatred they teach to Palestinian children from UNRWA schools. The barbaric hatred that we see from Hamas as they butchered, raped Jews on October 7th is in part the result of a Frankensteinian monster of the United Nations agency that the United Nations created. And the United States remains the top donor of that agency. The American people deserve to know why their tax money enabled the deadliest attack on the Jewish people since the Holocaust. Again, most of this is not new information. Many watchdog organizations have been warning us about UNRWA for years, and some of them are represented by our witnesses. I am grateful for their attendance and for their bringing us their essential insight so that we could try to change the field, the paradigm on the ground that has been taking place with the American taxpayer's dime. With that, I'd now like to recognize Ranking Member Susan Wild for as much time as you may need.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. The developments that we have learned about in the past few days are horrific. The fact that 12 UNRWA employees out of 13,000 staff members in Gaza were implicated in the October 7th massacres is deeply disturbing, and it only underscores the already clear need for reform. But the question we face right now is, how do we ensure that the innocent civilian population of Gaza that is facing famine does not pay an even steeper price in human life because of the actions of 12 horrific individuals and their actions? We know that for the civilian population in Gaza, UNRWA services have been a lifeline, regardless of what one thinks about UNRWA, its mission, or the many well-documented examples of its dysfunction. The facts on the ground right now are indisputable. It is the only entity on the ground with the systems and the personnel and the capacity to deliver what little relief there is for the people of Gaza. We're talking about shelters for more than 1 million people, emergency food delivery, and urgently needed health services. We know that 87% of the Gaza population is now estimated to rely on UNRWA services. But having said that, we also know that the events of the past days have created an unprecedented crisis of credibility for UNRWA. And we have to recognize that. It serves as a potent reminder of the entrenched and long-standing flaws of both the organization's functioning and its mandate. And I do believe that the administration was absolutely correct in pausing the funding. And I keep in mind, please, that it's not just the United States that has done this, but a number of other countries as well. But we have to have oversight, and we have to be vigilant. In short, what I believe is that we have to see a change in UNRWA that reflects the gravity of what took place. Over the medium term, the need for major organizational reform is clear. We have to prioritize reorganizing and restructuring aid for Palestinians in a way that better serves the needs of the innocent civilian people, but that also makes sure that the safety and security of the citizens of Israel is not affected, is not jeopardized by the fact that we are funding this humanitarian aid. And so I don't have a perfect answer. I am hoping that as I sit here listening to the testimony and listening to the members, that we will hear some constructive solutions free of politics that really will address this very important need for reform that we have, but that at the same time is cognizant of the fact that there are innocent civilians that are suffering, that are facing famine, and who unfortunately have Hamas as their government. And with that, I will yield back and just say that I hope we can all come together and find some sort of meaningful and constructive solutions for this. Thank you.
Thank you, Ranking Member Wild. The chair now recognizes the chairman of the Subcommittee on Global Health, Global Human Rights, and International Organizations, the congressman from New Jersey, Mr. Smith, for his opening statement.
Thank you very much, Chairman Maston. First of all, let me thank you that we are doing this joint hearing, bringing further focus and hopefully resolution, the beginning of resolutions to this horrific problem. Public pressure motivated by explosive new evidence that UNRWA employees were directly involved in the October 7th Hamas terrorist attack on Israel. The Biden administration last Friday, as we know, announced that it was, quote, temporarily paused additional funding for UNRWA while it reviews the evidence. With all due respect to the president, this was a long overdue response. Going far beyond the revelations of last week, however, there has been long been a massive and irrefutable evidence of UNRWA's extensive complicity and cooperation in Hamas's anti-Semitic, genocidal hate campaign. Like the Nazis before them, Hamas and their chief terrorism sponsor, Iran, they are committing genocide against the Jews. As many of you know, and many of my colleagues have read, and maybe some recently, the 1988 Hamas Charter demands the absolute destruction of the State of Israel and proclaims, quote, Israel will exist and will continue to exist until Islam obliterates it. Article 7 of the Hamas Charter demands the slaughter of all Jews. Quote, the day of judgment will not come until Muslims fight Jews and kill them. Then the Jews will hide behind rocks and trees, and the rocks and trees will cry out, O Muslim, there is a Jew hiding behind me. Come and kill him, close quote. Article 13 of the 1988 Charter of Hamas explicitly rejects initiatives for peace and reconciliation and states, quote, initiatives and so-called peaceful solutions and international conferences are in contradiction to the principle of the Islamic resistance movement. In its 2017 charter, building on the first one, Hamas reiterates its goal of wiping Israel off the face of the earth and says, quote, there is no alternative to a fully sovereign Palestinian state on the entire national Palestinian soil, with Jerusalem as its capital, close quote. In 2018, President Trump suspended all U.S. funding to UNRWA, and they survived without the 30% of their budget the U.S. typically provides. But tragically, in 2021, the Biden administration resumed lavish support from UNRWA without reform. The U.S. government has donated more than $1 billion to UNRWA since 2021. In fiscal year 2022, U.S. taxpayers gave UNRWA $364 million. In 23, $344 million. And in fiscal year 24, the U.S. is on track to provide $371 million. But the administration has failed to provide clarity about how much of this funding is affected by the pause announced on January 26th. Yesterday, joined by Chairman Mast and Chairman Wilson, we introduced H.R. 7122, legislation to prohibit our government from making any voluntary or involuntary contributions to UNRWA. A good deal of the evidence of UNRWA's involvement with Hamas and other terrorist groups, as well as educating children towards terrorism, that is, poisoning their minds, has been presented publicly at hearings, including 2 that I have chaired during the last 8 months. Those 2 hearings, one was on June 22nd and a second on November 8th. And we heard from some of the witnesses, including Hillel Neuer, who is here today. And the information is absolutely devastating, how these children from the earliest days of their lives are trained in hate for Jews and for Americans. Now we've heard how UNRWA's textbooks, curricula, summer camps, and official media are all infamous incubators of hate. And we've seen the evidence of its teachers' administration's involvement with Hamas. They don't make their case. As you can see, the hatred coming out of that particular man is So sad. UNRWA, the UN Relief Works Agency, was set up, as we know, in 1949 to provide aid to relief to refugees. 75 years later, it's still going, which is absurd in a way, since nearby Arab nations will not permit the former to integrate into their societies. UNRWA provides education in hatred of Jews for the vastly expanded number of children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren of the original refugees. UNRWA's textbooks, and I've had meeting after meeting on this, including hearings, where we've actually read through the textbooks, filled to overflowing with anti-Semitic hatred. This is all, this is serious. Aspects of its anti-Semitism is so twisted, I won't describe all of them here, but they talk about martyrdom, suicide bombers to children. A new report by the UN Watch, carefully documents, quote, how UNRWA teachers in a 300-member UNRWA staff Telegram group cheered and celebrated Hamas's October 7th massacre, while at the same time they were asking about their salaries. When are they going to get paid? The UNRWA staff in the group shared photos and video footage of those events and prayed for the terrorists' success and for Israel's destruction in clear violation of UN rules. Thank you, Hillel, for being here today, for testifying about this. Similarly, Impact SC has recently published 3 reports analyzing, quote, hundreds of pages of teaching materials revealing that content glorifying terrorism, inciting violence, and promoting anti-Semitism is actually included in UNRWA's own materials created by UNRWA staff for UNRWA students. Thank you, Mr. Sheff, for joining us to bear witness to that ugly, ugly truth. And Mr. Goldberg has pointed out, UNRWA doesn't recognize Hamas, Islamic Jihad, Hezbollah, or the PFLP as terrorist groups, does not submit staff, contractors, or beneficiaries for U.S. counterterrorism vetting. It indoctrinates generation after generation to hate Jews, to hate Israel, and prepare for genocide. For UNRWA, terror finance is a feature, he points out, not a bug, close quote. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. Chair now recognizes Mr. Crow for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Mast, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. The United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees in the Near East, or UNRWA, was established in 1949 with a mandate to provide humanitarian assistance and protection to registered Palestinian refugees. In carrying out this mandate, UNRWA has provided humanitarian assistance, including food, shelter, and medical care in 5 areas, including the West Bank, Gaza Strip, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. Thousands of UNRWA staff continue to go to work today amid very dangerous conditions to provide medical care, drive trucks, distribute aid, and play an essential coordinating role with aid organizations like the World Food Program and Israeli security authorities. Now, I am also deeply troubled by the allegations made last week about the 12 UNRWA employees that may have been involved in the horrific October 7th terrorist attack. And I echo the concerns of many, and I echo Secretary Blinken's concerns in sharing my support for a swift and thorough investigation and the need for absolute accountability for any participants in that attack. But we also have to understand that humanitarian aid in conflict zones must continue. And it's difficult under the best of circumstances. And we know that conditions in Gaza are far from that. Over 150 UNRWA staff members are among the over 25,000 Palestinians killed in Gaza in recent months. They're among those that wake each day with famine on the horizon and impossible conditions around every corner. UNRWA's humanitarian assistance is a lifeline to over 2 million Palestinians in Gaza who are sorely in need of that aid. And this is an organization largely reliant on voluntary contributions and financial peril from month to month, and one already facing a financial shortfall of hundreds of millions of dollars. It is also a lifeline to 3 million Palestinians living in Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. So if aid is cut or UNRWA is abandoned without a replacement or a different organization to fill that role, security in the region is further imperiled. And the burdens are then shifted onto other regional actors, including some of our allies. The complexity of this situation cannot be overstated. But my experience in combat zones and my understanding of our nation's 20 years of war in the Middle East have made it clear to me that conditions in which people are starving, fearful, or hopeless do not breed peace, and they will not bring security to Israel or to the broader region. People's basic needs must be met. So I have very deep concerns about the shift in funding and the halting of funding. I have very real concerns about the security impact and the moral implications if we do not find quickly a way to resume some funding and allow that aid to move forward expeditiously. The horrifying and inexcusable actions of roughly a dozen people should not speak for the over 13,000 UNRWA employees in Gaza alone. It is possible to acknowledge the life-saving nature of assistance that UNRWA provides and the importance of ensuring that humanitarian assistance reaches the people of Gaza without diversion or misuse by Hamas or other nefarious actors. Now, this is not to understate the very real challenges and concerns about the integrity of UNRWA that have been raised by my colleagues and others, and the need for substantial reform or to find a follow-on successor organization to fulfill the functions. What I'm trying to say here is that these needs and these functions must continue, whether it's under UNRWA or some other organization, and that all of our collective interests and security are undermined if we do not do that. And that has both short-term and long-term implications. So let's have a discussion today about how we achieve that, what the very real concerns that we all have, how they should be met, and how we can get that done in everyone's interests. Because, let me finish with this, we cannot stop the delivery of aid and the support of an organization that is essential to the livelihood of about 2 million Palestinian people. And I will continue to be a vocal advocate to make sure that we figure out a way forward here. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Crow. I now ask unanimous consent that the following members be allowed to sit on the dais and participate in today's hearing. The gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Murphy. Without objection, so ordered. I'm now going to recognize Ranking Member Smith for the introduction of our panel today. Mr. Smith, you're recognized.
Thank you very much. And let me first begin with our first witness, Richard Goldberg, who is a senior advisor at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. He previously served as Deputy Chief of Staff and Senior Foreign Policy Advisor to former U.S. Senator Mark Kirk, who not only was our Chief Counsel once on this committee, went on to become a distinguished U.S. Senator. He also Chief of Staff for the Illinois Governor, Bruce Rauner, and Director for Countering Iranian Terrorism Weapons of Mass Destruction on the White House National Security Council. He was sanctioned personally by Iran in 2020. Next, we'll hear from Marcus Schiff, who is the CEO of the Institute for Monitoring Peace and Cultural Tolerance in School Education, or IMPACT SE, a research and policy nonprofit that analyzes textbooks employing standards on peace and tolerance as derived from UNESCO's declarations and resolutions, and presents recommendations to governments, ministries of education, and to policymakers. Then we'll hear from Hillel Noor, who is the Executive Director of UN Watch, a human rights NGO in Geneva, Switzerland. He's an international lawyer, writer, acclaimed speaker, human rights activist, and matter of fact, since 2009, Mr. Noor has headed a coalition of 25 human rights groups as chair of the annual Geneva Summit for Human Rights and Democracy, a renowned international gathering that provides a global platform for courageous pro-democracy dissidents from around the world. And lastly, but certainly not least, we welcome Ms. Laura Rudman, who is the James R. Schlesinger Distinguished Professor at the Miller Center at the University of Virginia, and welcome her and her testimony and expertise to the committee. So if we could go to Mr. Goldberg as our first witness.
Thank you, Ranking Member Smith. I think you meant Mara. I think I had the wrong one on my paper as well. But we now recognize Mr. Goldberg for his opening statement.
Mr. Chairman, ranking members, all members of the committees, thank you so much for holding this very important hearing at this time. I have worked on oversight of our foreign assistance, including to UNRWA, for about 20 years now. And let me just tell you something. UNRWA is a horror show that is decades in the making, co-produced by the United States taxpayer. A lot of people woke up and read the Wall Street Journal or other reports and were shocked to hear that 12 employees of UNRWA participated in the October 7th massacre, that 10% or more of its staff in Gaza may be affiliated with terrorist organizations, and even more of them have some family members that are affiliates as well. I wasn't shocked. Many members of this committee who have worked on UNRWA reform for years weren't shocked. Terrorism support and subsidy for UNRWA is a feature, not a bug. The organization is built from its core mission, its mandate, to indoctrinate generation after generation to hate Jews, to destroy Israel, to be ready to manifest themselves as those that will come to wipe the Jews into the Mediterranean Sea to fulfill the mission that was outlined in 1948 by Arab armies, never fulfilled, but UNRWA established back then with a mandate to have the political manifestation, the political warfare arm, to get ready to fulfill that military mission. And decade after decade, pumping kids to hate through their schools, never recognizing U.S. designated foreign terrorist organizations as terrorist organizations. When you have a conversation with an UNRWA official and you say, is it possible your aid is going to Hamas? Is it possible families that are receiving cash assistance in your program are affiliated with designated foreign terrorist organizations? Is it possible your staff are affiliated with these groups? The answer is, of course, these are political labels to UNRWA. These aren't terrorist groups. These are political movements. So why would they want to discriminate based on political persuasion? And to a United States citizen, and I would say to our allies around the world, that is in fact horrific, disgusting, and part of the reason we sit here today. Now, when you look at the incitement to violence that has gone on for decades, the internalization in generation after generation to rise up and believe they are refugees waiting to come back to what is today Israel to drive the Jews into the sea, October 7th is the logical conclusion of UNRWA. It is, of course, what they have been training generations to do with the resources we have provided going to these terrorist organizations to help carry out that mission. We're focused on UNRWA in Gaza today because that's where the news is. Follow the news elsewhere where UNRWA operates. In the West Bank, the IDF is conducting daily operations today against terror cells in UNRWA facilities and UNRWA areas. In Lebanon, in the largest UNRWA refugee camp in Lebanon, there have been months of terrorist battles. There's no Israeli presence there. Anywhere UNRWA goes, terrorism follows. We've documented this for years. Now, you hear a lot of people saying, well, we can't cut off food, we can't cut off aid, we can't leave people starving. That's true, that's correct. Nobody is calling for that. If only we had another organization that was built to help refugees around the world and internally displaced persons around the world. We should think of such an organization. Oh, that's right, it exists. The UN High Commissioner for Refugees. If only we had an organization built to distribute food aid. That's right, we give them billions of dollars. It's called the World Food Program. If only there was an organization for children and for schools and education and for healthcare. They're all available. It's an alphabet soup. The only reason to remain dedicated to supporting the terror, financing, incitement promoting, genocide promoting UNRWA is to help UNRWA keep Hamas in power in Gaza, promote terrorism incitement against Israel, and maintain a mandate that the region has moved on from, and that is to hate Israel, destroy Israel. The Arab armies that failed in 1948, that set up UNRWA as a political weapon, have moved on. They've made peace with Israel. UNRWA hasn't. UNRWA is the problem. UNRWA is a part of what happened on October 7th, and it will keep happening again and again if we keep funding it.
I want to thank you, Mr. Goldberg. Chair now recognizes Mr. Sheff for his opening statement.
Chairman Smith, Chairman Mast, Ranking Member Wild, Ranking Member Crow, members of committee, thank you. On October the 7th, terrorists breached Gaza's border with Israel. The result was catastrophic. They raped children, women, and men, burned families alive, beheaded, and murdered. They abducted babies and the elderly. 132 are still being held in dungeons in Gaza. And we know that UNRWA
Gentlemen will
employees...
suspend for a moment. Gentlemen will resume.
Thank you, sir. We know that UNRWA employees took part in this massacre. But these were not a few bad apples. Rather, the institutional barrel is rotten. How do we know? We know by researching UNRWA's educational infrastructure. In it, textbooks teach that Jews are liars and fraudsters who spread corruption, which will lead to their annihilation. Students are taught about cutting the necks of the enemy, that a fiery massacre of Jews on a bus is celebrated as a barbecue party, that Dalal Mughrabi, who murdered 38 people and 13 children, is a role model. UNRWA educates that dying is preferable to living, that becoming a martyr will be rewarded in heaven. First graders are taught the alphabet by learning the words for attack and martyr. And fourth graders are taught addition by counting martyrs. These are just a handful of examples of incitement which runs like a thread, a strategy, throughout the Palestinian curriculum which is taught in UNRWA schools. And our research shows the same violent, jihadi educational materials are created on a large institutional level by UNRWA staff. One of our reports confirms that at least 100 Hamas members who carried out terror attacks in the past were educated, celebrated by being part of the UNRWA system. And the stark truth, given that over half the schools in Gaza are UNRWA run, is that the majority of the October 7 terrorists are more likely than not to have been UNRWA school graduates. And make no mistake, the terrorist barbarity is cheered by UNRWA teachers. Another of our reports reveals dozens celebrated the massacre on social media. These extremist views go way beyond a handful of individuals. Rather, they are endemic to the institution. UNRWA staff are previously found to be extremists, from school principal Suhail al-Hindi of Hamas's Politburo to convicted terrorist Saeed Siam, 23 years, an UNRWA teacher. An Impact SC has warned for years about the consequences of this hate education. And I ask you, what can UNRWA possibly offer the next generation of Palestinians? Poisonous textbooks, taught too often by extremist teachers? Quite simply, UNRWA is not fit for purpose. But there is an alternative. Elsewhere in the region, the UAE has produced a curriculum that is centered around peace, tolerance, and acceptance of the other. Saudi Arabia has removed practically all the anti-Semitism and violent jihad from its textbooks. Israeli textbooks center peacemaking and feature a Palestinian narrative. Moroccan textbooks embrace Jews, the Amazigh, and they empower girls. Egypt is reforming its textbook system comprehensively. In other words, we look at the region and extremist UNRWA schools stand increasingly alone. It has chosen to teach conflict and violence over hope and over peace. But it is a path we can no longer afford to walk down. One thing is clear. If we want to prevent the next massacre, if we want to dream of peace, then UNRWA can play no further part in Palestinian education. There are alternatives. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Schiff. I now recognize Mr. Newer for his opening statement.
Chairman, ranking members, members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to testify today. For years, we've been told by UNRWA and its supporters that the agency performs life-saving work and that its teachers offer Palestinian students an education that promotes human rights, tolerance, equality, and non-discrimination. Today, more than ever before, and I mean literally today, in light of the bombshell news reports in yesterday's Wall Street Journal, Reuters, and elsewhere, we now know this has been a lie. From these and other revelations of the past few days, we know that in Gaza, at least 12 UNRWA employees personally participated in the massacre of October 7th, which involved the murder of 1,200 Israelis, along with mass rape, torture, and mutilation. Secretary of State Blinken said yesterday, these intelligence reports are highly, highly credible. The world also learned yesterday that 1,200 UNRWA employees in Gaza are part of Hamas or Islamic Jihad, meaning actual operatives within the political and military organizations. Finally, an estimated 6,000 UNRWA employees, being half of the workforce in Gaza, have close family members in these terrorist organizations. Now, UNRWA's top donors, the United States, Germany, Britain, Canada, and many others, have just announced they're freezing funds. Now, accordingly, I've come here from Geneva to bring before the Congress our case against UNRWA. I've come here to ask the Congress of the United States, which is the largest donor to UNRWA at over $300 million a year, to not just suspend, but to end the funding for good, and to take the lead in dissolving an organization that is riddled with incitement to hate, involvement in terrorism, and the perpetuation of war. Members of the committee will find all of the evidence that I present here on our website at unwatch.org under the case against UNRWA. Now, on Friday, Secretary General Guterres announced that he was, quote, horrified to learn that members of his UNRWA staff were implicated in terrorism. Members of the committee, I'm here to bear witness and testify that Secretary General Guterres, the head of UNRWA, Philippe Lazzarini, their predecessors, their senior colleagues, could not possibly have been shocked that UNRWA employees are implicated in terrorism. Because for the past 9 years, and Chairman Smith knows this very well because he's been on this issue and he's invited me to testify, we've been uncovering, publishing, and submitting to the UN, to UNRWA, evidence of widespread and systematic incitement to jihadi terrorism, the praise of Nazi leader Adolf Hitler, calls to slaughter Jews on the part of UNRWA teachers, school principals, and other employees. These reports range from 10 to 200 pages. For example, just in November, we sent a report on 20 teachers who celebrated the October 7th massacre. In March, together with Impact SE, we identified 133 UNRWA teachers and staff who promoted hate and violence on social media. In June 2022, we released a report called UNRWA's Teachers of Hate. It included the following Facebook post by Elham Mansour, quote, an UNRWA teacher, quote, by Allah, anyone who can kill and slaughter any Zionist and Israeli criminal and doesn't do so doesn't deserve to live. Kill them and pursue them everywhere. They are the greatest enemy. All Israel deserves is death. This is an UNRWA teacher statement on Facebook. We sent it to the UN. They did nothing. We sent them reports in 2021, 2019, 2017, 2015, numerous reports. They never contacted us for information. They refused our repeated written requests to meet to discuss the problem. They cannot say they didn't know. Mr. Guterres knew. The head of the UNRWA knew. The United Nations knew. They simply chose not to act. But it's much worse than that. From the beginning, their response to our reports was to attack us for doing the work they failed to do. If we look at Christopher Gunnis, the longtime UNRWA spokesman, he's now come back as a surrogate, giving interviews on Al Jazeera. He said on Twitter the following in response to our reports, quote, appeal to journalists, please don't turn UN Watch baseless allegations about anti-Semitism into a he said, she said story. It's a non-story. Quote, UN Watch makes a fool of itself again, credibility dead in the water. Will anyone believe them again? Quote, he's interested to find out more about UN Watch's political and financial affiliations since its establishment. Can anyone advise? This was their response to smear the messenger. They are not interested in finding out the root problem of incitement to terrorism. In June 2022, when they had to suspend 6 out of 10 of their employees under pressure from the US, UNRWA Deputy Commissioner General Lenny Stensteth, who's now the Director General of the Norwegian Foreign Ministry, she informed donor states and put it on her website that, quote, the real intent of UN Watch, my organization, is, quote, to destroy and not build, and to invite conflict, not build a lasting peace. Now, the US and other donors have asked UNRWA to investigate and to ensure accountability. I can tell you for a decade, UNRWA has shown itself to be unwilling, unable, and unfit. Today, I wish to present our new report called UNRWA's Terrorgram, which I've handed to each of the members, and it's on our website, unwatch.org. In this report, we document a Telegram chat group of over 3,000 UNRWA teachers in Gaza that is replete with messages, photos, and videos cheering and celebrating the massacre of October 7th. It includes, for example, Safa Mohammed al-Najjar on the morning of October 7th. She's an UNRWA teacher of computers in Gaza, an administrator of this Telegram group. She celebrated the massacre, posting videos. She praised the Hamas Mujahideen, the holy warriors, as they massacred, mutilated, and raped Israelis. UNRWA English teacher Abdallah Mejez shared a message from Hamas urging Gazans to stay put, to ignore Israeli messages asking them to evacuate for their safety, effectively doing the work of Hamas to ask Gazans to be human shields. This is an UNRWA teacher. Abdul Karim Mejer, in our report, an elementary school teacher, celebrated the Hamas terrorists, saying, quote, may Allah keep their feet steady and guide their aim. When a group member wondered what these heroes, the terrorists, as they're perpetrating the massacre, what they were brought up on, Mejer replied, they imbibed jihad and resistance with their mother's milk. And a few days later, this UNRWA teacher asked he asked Hamas to execute their Israeli hostages. When Stefan Dujarric, the UN spokesman, was asked about our information, he replied on January 11th, quote, I mean, UN Watch, they have a track record. And I think from our end, it speaks for itself. He tried to disparage us. Just to conclude, we have massive incitement to terrorism. Prominent people have said bad apples. It's a few bad apples. We're talking about 1,200 who belong to the organization, 3,000 in this group, 6,000 whose family members belong to it. This is not a problem of bad apples. It's rotten to the core. We've talked about incitement. We've talked about acts of actual violence. And finally, let's get to the core problem. And with that, I conclude. The core problem of UNRWA, the very purpose of the agency, is to perpetuate the war of 1948, to send the message to Palestinians that the war of 1948 is not over. Don't use cement to build homes, hospitals, and schools here in Gaza. Use it to build hundreds of miles of terror tunnels, to tunnel into Israel, to invade Israel, to go back to what your homes are. That is the message of UNRWA. We should not be surprised what happened on October 7th, because that is the message that these Palestinians got for more than 70 years in UNRWA schools. UNRWA is a failure. We have to recognize what the Swiss Foreign Minister Ignazio Cassis said. This is a country historically that supports the UN. He said the following, I quote, UNRWA has become part of the problem. It supplies the ammunition to continue the conflict. By supporting UNRWA, we keep the conflict alive. It's a perverse logic. And I'm here to say, if the United States and other governments that fund UNRWA truly care about helping Palestinians and Israelis, it's time to put an end to this perverse logic. We're asking the Congress to take the lead in dissolving this agency. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Neuer. I now recognize Ms. Rudman for her opening statement.
Thank you. And I thank
Microphone, ma'am.
Thank you. And I thank the subcommittee chairs and ranking.
You could speak
member.
into it just a little bit more. I think
Doing
everybody
my
will hear
best.
you better.
Thank you. I'd like to thank you and the ranking member and Subcommittee Chair Smith, members of the committee, for the opportunity to appear before you. I have warm memories of my service on this committee staff as legal counsel under Chair Lee Hamilton. So much of how I learned to approach U.S. foreign policy and the important oversight responsibilities of this committee, I attribute to the tutelage of Lee Hamilton. Of course, I alone am responsible for my statement here today. In my written testimony, I discuss, first, the U.S. national security interests at stake in this topic. Second, Palestinian basic needs historically, particularly in Gaza, and why meeting them is intrinsic to Israeli security and regional security and stability. And third, why I continue to see a case for U.S. support for UNRWA and or other UN entities with appropriate oversight and related pauses where necessary until and unless alternatives are created. Such support is critical for serving U.S. national security interests and sustainable security for the State of Israel. In my brief time with you now, I want to highlight 5 key points. Number 1, I am not here to defend UNRWA, which has many shortcomings, well documented, including here today. So let's start with its most immediate failures. We've talked about those. They've fired 12 staff who, based on reporting and the strength and rapidity, I would say, of the U.S. pause as well on funding, were clearly operatives who participated in the barbaric ISIS-like Hamas attack on Israelis. And there are allegations that more of the 13,000 Palestinians on UNRWA's payroll may be affiliated in some way with the Hamas movement. In my experience working with Israeli military, Palestinian leaders, and UN officials, I found some in UNRWA leadership to tend toward the sanctimonious, too often painting only in black and white, when the reality was much more often a continuum between the two. And in so doing, they rarely acknowledged faults or shortcomings within their own organization. This has rendered them on occasion blind and often blinkered in their outlook. 2, UNRWA's mission is unique, and it is critical to Israel's security and regional stability. UNRWA is mandated to provide assistance and protection specifically to some 5.4 million registered refugees, as has been pointed out in Gaza, the West Bank, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. UNRWA's mandate includes providing education, healthcare, social services to its target population, as well as employment and direct relief. There is no other organization right now, it's not WFP, not UNHCR, that is set up to be able to take the reins tomorrow and fulfill this. UNRWA employs 13,000 Palestinians in Gaza. It's the single largest employer in Gaza. It runs the only public school system in Gaza. A majority of the 2 million Palestinians in Gaza depended on UNRWA assistance before October 7th. For the services UNRWA provides to a desperate population, there is no substitute at this time. It does not mean that there are opportunities to create ways forward. But in terms of what they're doing right now, there is no substitute. And they are providing for the most basic needs, number 3, the most basic needs of Palestinians, which is part and parcel of providing for security for the state of Israel. Having 2 million famished, increasingly desperate people, long treated as expendable by de facto Hamas rulers with no ability to move and limited ability to provide for themselves and their families within walking distance of southern Israel threatens Israeli security and stability. Palestinians who are food secure and able to sustain themselves and their families and have a political horizon that will one day realistically offer a better future for their children alongside a state of Israel, are Palestinians less likely to be drawn to or be forced to serve terrorist forces such as Hamas. Number 4, Israeli military officials long have been committed to getting humanitarian assistance into Gaza. Israeli military officials. I know from the countless hours I spent with them on the details, they prioritized doing so because they saw it as directly serving Israeli security interests. They worked closely with UNRWA leaders and other UN officials to devise the most effective and secure means for executing these aims. They did so appreciating that there was risk involved, but they saw far greater risk to their country and to their security if goods were not able to flow, and they knew these UN entities were vital actors to ensure provision of such services in Gaza in particular. 5, U.S. aid to UNRWA is key to meeting basic needs of Palestinians, particularly in Gaza, and that's critical to Israel's security and to U.S. security. For that aid to resume, we need a framework to assess what has gone so terribly wrong with the agency and whether it can be righted with internal reform or requires a transition of responsibilities to another organization within or outside the UN. The development and oversight of the audit necessary for such assessment should be led from outside of UNRWA, no question. I have some thoughts on who could do that. Aid must resume to UNRWA at the same time, though, as the assessment is being carried out. The United States, Israel, the world cannot afford the risk of famine taking root in Gaza. That problem will not stay in Gaza. It's very directly threatening to the security and stability of Israel and the region, and thus the United States. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. I now recognize myself for questions, and I'd like to start with you, looking at some of your comments here. You said that you're not here to defend UNRWA, but you did also say in your comments that you are here to make the case that we should continue to support UNRWA. Kind of sounds to me a little bit like having your cake and eating it too. But I want to ask you a few questions about this. Do the Rohingya have an UNRWA?
I believe I stated, sir, that UNRWA is a unique agency with a unique vision, and also that it's
So
not
no UNRWA for
replaceable at this
Rohingya?
time.
No UNRWA for Rohingya? None? Ma'am, no UNRWA for Rohingya?
Sir, as I said, UNRWA is unique.
No UNRWA for Sudanese?
That would imply, by an organization being unique, that there is not a similar organization elsewhere in the world.
So none for the Sudanese either, correct? You've worked in this field,
I'm sorry,
none for the
sir.
Sudanese?
I'm doing my best to answer your question, which I believe
Thanks.
I'm doing.
Yeah, none for the Sudanese either. So I'd like to know, from your opinion, what percent or number of UNRWA employees do you believe are Hamas or support Hamas?
I don't have the basis for making that assessment. I read the same press reports that I'm sure you've read that talk about a percentage within UNRWA that is roughly around the same percentage as estimated in the Palestinian population at large in Gaza, so between 10 and 15%.
Say that one. Your estimate is that between 10 and 15% of UNRWA employees, just to make sure I'm hearing you correctly, are possibly Hamas or supportive of Hamas or Palestinian Islamic Jihad or Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade or one of the terrorist organizations that exists in the Gaza Strip.
What I am saying, sir, is that press reports have indicated that the percentages of UNRWA staff that may be affiliated in some way with Hamas are roughly similar to the percentages in the general population that are thought to be affiliated, so between 10 and 15%. But I want to be clear
Do you look at that and
that
say,
I'm relying on
that's
press
out of this
reports.
world, that's crazy, no way, not a chance? Or do you look at it and say, seems like it might be a reasonable estimate?
I believe if they employ 13,000 people in the population of the single biggest employer, it would not be surprising if the percentages are roughly that of the general population.
Thank you. As you're here to make the case for continued support for UNRWA, per your statement, what would you need to see to say, this is a threshold, this has gone too far, there can no longer be support for UNRWA? Would it be if UNRWA fired 100 people? If they said 100 people, we have the evidence these individuals took part in the attack, would that to you reach the threshold of saying, all right, I'm no longer here to support UNRWA?
I'm here, sir, to look at what's in the best interest of U.S. national security, which was my teaching under the former chair of this committee, and what's in the best interest of Israel's security. And I believe that is finding some function, some way of providing for the most basic needs of Palestinians.
So 100 people confirmed working for Hamas as a part of UNRWA for you would not be a threshold for cutting ties with UNRWA?
So for me, what would be a threshold is finding a suitable framework that can be put in place both to evaluate UNRWA and to be able to go forward with other means of providing aid at the same time.
So there's no threshold for bad behavior?
The threshold is U.S. national security interests and concerns for me, sir.
No threshold for bad behavior, though?
Same answer applies.
So none. And I think this is concerning because I heard this in remarks from my colleagues. You were invited here as the Democrat witness of choice. They chose for you to be the person that they requested to be here. And again, in your remarks, you say that you're here to make the case for continued support of UNRWA. And I think this is what we're going to continue to see, very likely from the administration, is this case that there is no threshold for bad behavior. It doesn't matter if it's one individual that was a part of Hamas or one of these other terrorist organizations, or 100 that were a part of them that took part in the attacks, or there's 100 right now that are participating in holding hostages. Doesn't matter. No threshold for bad behavior. This is some sacrosanct entity that just simply must continue no matter what. And that can't be the case that we have moving forward. I will not show support for that, especially, as I said in my opening statement, I think that we have a shell game going on from the administration right now where they're saying that they're cutting off the funding, pausing the funding for UNRWA, but in fact, they waited until just after they allowed tens of millions of dollars to be released to UNRWA, and then now they are saying they're going to pause funding for UNRWA. Absolute shell game, in my opinion. In that, I'm now going to yield time to Ranking Member Crow for as many questions as he needs to ask.
Thank you, Chairman. Well, first of all, we need to just clear the air here. You mischaracterized our witness's testimony repeatedly and tried to put words into her mouth. She did not say at any point that there's no threshold for bad behavior. In fact, she specifically answered your question about what the criteria and the framework should be, and that is centering our national security and our interests, centering Israel's security and interests, as well as the rights and dignity of the Palestinian people. Those should be the measures and the gauges. And frankly, I will push back on the notion that she answered in the manner in which you characterized her answer.
Did you want to yield to me, or?
Yeah, I'll yield to you.
Yeah, I did very specifically ask her to clarify. Are you saying that there is no threshold? I asked the question. Are you saying
she answered what her threshold was. She gave a very clear answer to that.
no threshold for bad behavior?
No, she provided the framework for what her threshold was.
Which was no
Because it
threshold.
wasn't your answer, you kept going after her.
I asked for, I don't want to take up your time, it's yours, but I did ask if there's no threshold for bad behavior
And she answered very clearly.
without
So,
her.
Ms. Rudman, I will reclaim my time, if that's fine for you, Chairman? Absolutely. All right. What I also heard you say, Ms. Rudman, is that you have no allegiance or loyalty to UNRWA, the organization, right? Just like me, right? I have no allegiance and loyalty to any one organization. I'm not going to sit here and defend UNRWA, nor should I, and I have very real concerns. What I have an allegiance and loyalty to is the mission, right? The services that are being provided by this entity. And that is your concern as well. So what I want to do is get beyond the point where people just criticize, because the problem with policy right now is we're very long on criticism. People roll in here and they're very long on criticism and they're very short on solutions. So I'd like to take a moment to talk about solutions, right? And you made a very clear point that despite the very real concerns about UNRWA, they are the only game in town on some very key points. That right now there's no other entity that exists that provides the scope of services that UNRWA provides to the Palestinian people. So could you explain for us for a moment, given your vast experience in this area and the substantial time that you've spent personally in Gaza, how we would go about identifying those core services and transitioning them either to existing organizations that currently don't provide those services or to create a new entity that would still do it. Because at the end of the day, there are very important things that need to happen, right? And services that need to be provided. So how do we get there?
Thank you, Representative Crow, for your comments and for the question. I think that the most basic needs, I'm going to put, though I recognize for this panel, education is a primary focus. I would focus first on food and water and electricity, understanding and appreciating the importance of education as well. And so I would look at the structures inside Gaza, the staffing and the employees. As we've talked about, UNRWA has many more than they have the whole infrastructure inside. So how do you replicate that? That would require figuring out whether it's UNHCR, I think less likely, UNDP is quite active in Gaza, but again, not anywhere near the numbers. World Food Program that handles distribution and goods going in and out, but not with, again, staff on the ground to carry out the delivery of these means. There are ways you might be able to divide the responsibilities among and between, but you're still going to need screening mechanisms, auditing mechanisms, things to ensure that what has happened with UNRWA and their staff is not replicated elsewhere. What I can tell you is that the Israeli military, recognizing absolutely the importance of getting goods into Gaza, does not want to be, ought not to be, for a variety of reasons, in Gaza responsible for distribution of that food. They're quite active on the crossing points at, and have been historically, again, pre-October 7th, at Nir Oz and at a couple of the other crossing points, thank you, Karen Shalom, and so watch very closely goods coming in and out and have kind of strict means for that. So there are roles, again, for Israeli military, but they are not inside Gaza. So what I would do is figure out exactly who does what, who has which resources in which ways, how do you make sure that food and water, the basic necessities, are getting into people, and how you develop the mechanisms to better screen staff who are working for any of these agencies at the same time, not just UNRWA.
And because UNRWA is an organization that historically lives paycheck to paycheck, so to speak, and the United States and I believe 9 other countries at this point have joined the U.S. in cutting funding, and I've seen estimates that funding will run out by mid-February. Is it your professional opinion that what you just described could be accomplished in 2 weeks? Or do we really need to look seriously at, an interim gap measure, or to resume some limited funding with appropriate oversight to make sure people don't starve to death in that time?
That's exactly my concern. I don't think it can be reserved, and it can be put in place by flipping a switch. And it will take time. I think it's important that it be done. I think there are ways of doing it, but it's not going to happen in a week or two. And I heard that the view that there's much more money out there. UNRWA is very much paycheck to paycheck, probably like still paying last month's debts. And the United States and Germany are about kind of over 500 million between the two. So quite a significant impact. So there needs to, my view is there needs to be some transition plan, which I recognize is not, and I don't speak for the United States government, I have not heard what their plan is on that front.
Okay, thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Crow. And I would say that I do not have an allegiance to UNRWA's mission. My allegiance is to America and Americans singularly. I now yield to Ranking Member Smith.
I appreciate that. Mr. Goldberg, you talked about the horror show, and I think that was a very apt description of what UNRWA does. I mean, do you know of any instance where an UNRWA employee or leader dissented from Hamas and offered a vision that was inclusive and respectful of Jews? Mr. Sheff, you talked about the hate and violence being endemic. When I was growing up, I remember 8 or 9 years old, I saw the musical by Rodgers and Hammerstein called South Pacific, and there was one song that as a young kid caught my attention, and I've thought of it ever since in all of my human rights work, and I do a lot of it, because it talked about hate. 2 of the paragraphs, 2 of the song. You've got to be taught to hate and fear. You've got to be taught from year to year. It's got to be drummed into your dear little ear. You've got to be carefully taught. You've got to be taught before it's too late, before you are 6 or 7 or 8, to hate all the people your ancestors, relatives hate. You've got to be carefully taught. In my opinion, and I've been at this, I served with Lee Hamilton, I've been raising UNRWA issues for decades. We've given them, as a U.S. government, $7 billion years to date. And we get crickets back. We get false reform that never happens. There's no transparency. And unfortunately, it has gotten worse over the years. And we've seen the results. One generation of young people after another who wants to kill Jewish people, who hate Jewish people, have an absolute ugly caricature of who Jewish people and Jewish kids and adults actually are, and dream of the day when they are all killed. I mean, is there anybody in an UNRWA camp or in an UNRWA school that dissents from the Hamas Charter of 1988 and stands up and say, that charter is an outrage when you talk about human rights? Do they? I don't see them doing it. If they do, what happens to them? Ms. Hillel, you talked about bombshell revelations. None of this is a bombshell to you or me and others who've been following this. I've met with the UNRWA board over the years. They always have a nice, slick presentation that sounds like, wow, what are we talking about? They know better than us. And yes, I understand why the Israelis, as a matter of necessity, would have to do some kind of accommodation. What else are they going to do? When the entire international community, including the United States, are all on board of saying this is the means to the end. I believe that the people in Gaza do need to get food, clothing, shelter, and their children need an education that is free of anti-Semitic hate. That's what they deserve. This brainwashing, frankly, in my opinion, is child abuse of these kids. You wonder why they're filled with all this hate. They're taught year and a year and a year and a year. And so if you want to comment on that as well. I do believe we need a new platform. I don't know if the UNHCR or any of those, maybe, necessity is the mother of invention. This has to be the pivot point, what has happened with UNRWA now. And the international community, including the Biden administration, and if he gets another term or whoever follows, has to say, enough is enough. Otherwise, this will be happening again. A couple of years, we'll have another instance like this, and we'll have more kids toting AK-47s and rocket grenade launchers and other means of violence who are killing innocent people. As you said, Mr. Chef, about the burning bus. You see that bus burning, and they're celebrating. I mean, that is disgusting on steroids. And I do hope, you would speak to what might be a follow-on group. But, they say we're going to go right back to UNRWA. And we're going to go right back to the same teachers who have been inculcating this hate-filled agenda, which is poisoning those kids. Those kids need, we see it with child soldiers in Uganda. Remember all those years? I've worked on all of that, too. These kids needed to be deprogrammed and find a way out of the hate that they have been, that has been inculcated into their hearts, minds, and souls, in this case by their teachers. So if you could speak to that,
Sure.
Mr. Chef or Mr. Booth.
Go ahead.
Sure. I've never heard that musical reference before. Extremely apposite, and thank you so much for that. Yes, textbooks are uniquely authoritative, especially in the MENA region, in the Middle East, where you get one book, one grade, one subject, and they carry the values, the identities that leaders wish to pass down to the next generation, for good or for bad. This is how we create the societies of the future that we want to see, through these textbooks, through education. And of course, for bad, we know that one of the first things that Hitler did when he came to power was change the textbooks. And there he was in 1939 with enough young people who would join the Einsatzgruppen and commit those terrible acts they committed. And textbooks were used then for good by the Germans after the war in order to de-radicalize that society. They are incredibly powerful. And yes, Palestinian children deserve a set of textbooks which is filled with ideas of peace and tolerance, with those UNESCO standards. And this is not rocket science, by the way. This has been done time and time and time again. These textbooks can be changed in a matter of weeks. They look like this. What you're looking at here is a Palestinian textbook. This one actually has a picture of Dalal Mughrabi, the terrorist I was telling you about before, which is taught in Palestinian Authority schools, which is taught in UNRWA schools, and was taught in Hamas schools. It's a magazine. All you need to do is switch the PDF, put in material which is better than Dalal Mughrabi, material which can inspire young people rather than teach them to be terrorists. Weeks. That is how long it can take in order to change this school curriculum. So we're talking about what can we do in the future. Again, this can be done really simply. Those schools in Gaza can have a new school curriculum which is filled with these ideas of peace and tolerance. And by the way, it needs to be the Palestinian Authority as well, because they are producing this. UNRWA is teaching the textbooks which the Palestinian Authority created, as well, of course, as UNRWA creating its own material. So let us insist on this. Let us demand this. Futures absolutely rely on changing these textbooks. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chef. Mr. Smith.
Just one very brief follow-up.
Sure.
I remember in June of 2021, UNRWA was pressured into removing their Gaza director after he gave an interview that Hamas and others condemned. Could you perhaps, you could give us a little background on what happened there?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That episode is actually a very telling episode. There was a war between Israel and Hamas in May of 2021, and afterwards, the UNRWA Gaza director, Matthias Schmel, a German national, was interviewed on Israeli TV, and he was asked whether the Israeli strikes against Hamas were precise. And he said, yes, they were very precise. And he wasn't thinking when he gave his answer to adhere to the Hamas script, which UNRWA officials invariably do and everyone else in Gaza does because it's an authoritarian terrorist regime. If you don't follow the script when you speak to the media, when you're going to get in a lot of trouble. You're going to get hurt very badly. And he said, he conceded that Israel's strikes against Hamas were very precise. They were able to hit a precise point when they were successful and not hit civilians and so forth. And moments later, there were protests orchestrated by Hamas throughout Gaza. There were pictures of him photoshopped onto an Israeli military uniform as if he was an Israeli, even though he's someone who is quite anti-Israel for many years. But because he slipped in his interview, he was deemed persona non grata, protests against him and his deputy, and he was forced to leave. Hamas forced the head of UNRWA in Gaza to leave. Then his boss, Deputy Commissioner General Lenny Stenseth, a former Norwegian diplomat who's gone back to Oslo to be the head of their foreign ministry, she went to visit Yahya Sinwar. He is the evil mastermind of the October 7th massacre, someone who kills people with his own hands, Palestinians with his own hands, who he considers collaborators, a vicious murderer. She went to see him. This is their headline in a newspaper. And she said that she wants to reaffirm her solidarity with the Palestinians. Basically, the message was, we went off script, but don't worry.
Mr. Newer. Thank you. Thank you for your testimony. The chair now recognizes Ms. Wild.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My first and foremost concern is always for children. It was unbearable to see what happened to Israeli children on October 7th and since, when they were tortured, murdered, taken hostage, many of them having to witness their parents' murders. It was horrific. It's equally unbearable, at least for me, to watch what Palestinian children are suffering and their deaths, their medical problems, which are extensive, their hunger. And so I start with the children as a starting point, because I think that if we consider all children to be innocent and deserving of a safe place to live, water to drink and food to eat, we might be able to find some common ground in solving this problem. And aside from that basic humanitarian concept, I think we have to recognize that desperate childhoods often give rise to violence in adulthood, whether it's here in the United States or elsewhere. And I think we can all agree we don't want to create future generations of terrorists. Full stop on that. So with that, I'm going to direct my question to you, Ms. Rudman, to the national security part of this. You've got a special expertise in national security, and your testimony, your written testimony, has reflected that focus. Thank you for that very comprehensive report. Could you talk about this concept of aid to the Palestinian civilian population from a national security perspective?
Sure. Thank you, Congresswoman. The issue is, as you have reflected, the threat from the risk to security from people who are desperate. And Gaza, I was first there in 1987 or 1988. It has never been an easy place to live. It has gotten worse and more difficult even before October 7th, and certainly under Hamas rule. I will just say on that point to Chairman Smith's comment, I actually do know a number of Palestinians who survived very difficult childhoods, who survived UNRWA schools. They cannot speak out publicly in Gaza because of the nature of Hamas rule and the lack of freedom of speech, but there are any number of Palestinians who are absolutely concerned about both their future, their children's future. Those who could left, and are living other places, also under very difficult circumstances. But there are any number of people who can be reached with their basic needs being taken care of, while they cannot do it themselves, who want jobs, who want futures. And it's in our national security interest to find a way, and Israel, I believe, has repeatedly made the calculation that it's in their security interest as well, to ensure that basic needs are covered for people who, and let's just be clear, these are people who, it is a small area from Israel itself. Gaza is maybe twice the size of Washington, D.C., but with no entrance or exit. But it is actually walking distance, as the Hara, and I was at Kibbutz Nir Oz. I was at Kibbutz Be'eri in December. They are within easy walking distance of Gaza. And in addition to that, there's a population of 3.5 million Palestinians in the West Bank who watch, reflect, see what's happening to Palestinians in Gaza, and react as well. And so on the relative scale of what it costs the United States, and I don't make light of what $300 million is. That's a significant amount of money. But the cost to the United States, the cost to Israel, the cost to regional stability of not feeding people, of not getting water in, is far, far higher than a clearly inadequate agency, but the agency that has the infrastructure doing it until and unless we have an alternative. So I think it very much comes back to the risk that the United States is willing to take on in this situation, and the risk that Israel will absorb as well if we do not find a means to continue to go forward with basic services.
Thank you. I would have follow-up, except that my time is up. Thank you very much. I yield.
Thank you, Ranking Member Wild. Chair now recognizes Mr. Perry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ladies and gentlemen, I think it shocks the conscience of every person, even if you've, because of your profession in arms, have been exposed to some of this kind of stuff, to see the kind of carnage that's happened in Israel and Gaza since October. Shocks the conscience. However, there's a reason this is happening. And it's not the Jews that attacked Gaza. It is not the Jews. Mr. Neuer, UNRWA's Commissioner General Lazzarini, do you know of any time that he has denounced the Hamas Charter?
No, sir. I'm aware of no time that he has ever denounced the Hamas Charter.
And I suspect, like me, you have read the Hamas Charter and you know that it specifically calls for the destruction of Israel and the massacre of Jewish people.
Absolutely.
Mr. Goldberg, does the United Nations Relief Workers Agency, UNRWA, the United Nations Relief Workers Agency, does it provide cash or simply material supplies to the people in Gaza? How does, for the American people that aren't familiar, how does that work?
There is a range of services that would typically be provided by state actors. And so rather than, this is, by the way, why if you're a supporter of a two-state solution, I've never understood why you support UNRWA. It's antithetical to statehood building. But there are a number of range of local government type services, streets and sanitations, housing, education. So a lot of services that are being provided. But there's also cash assistance. Now, back in the day when we started oversight in the Congress, this was literally bags of cash being handed out, and they didn't ask.
So can I drill down on that? Because Ms. Rudman, I think, appropriately said, you know, we've got to provide food, water, electricity. I imagine when you say housing, that might be building material. And I'm thinking in my mind's eye, thinking back to pictures from Gaza of tunnels. Tunnels are hard to build. You know, you need equipment. Remember, the tunnels were lighted, so that's electricity. My point is, for a concrete tunnel with electricity, you probably got the concrete somewhere. You probably got the electricity somewhere. And it's reasonable to believe, I think, that the American taxpayer has been a part and parcel to funding that stuff. Is that a stretch for me?
That is not a stretch, sir. That is guaranteed.
So if I'm running my household and I only have so much a month to feed my family, provide a roof over the head, clothing, and education, but I want to spend all my money killing my neighbor, is it my neighbor's job then to go ahead and continue to provide the roof over my head and the food in my belly? Does that seem reasonable to anybody here? Mr. Goldberg, does it seem reasonable to you?
Nothing about UNRWA has ever seemed reasonable to me.
Well, the United Nations Relief Workers Agency is a terrorist-supporting entity, ladies and gentlemen. America's taxpayers pay for the absolute worst of it. The absolute worst of it. They pay for all, they don't get a say. They send over the money, they send over the material, and it gets used against America's interests. It gets used against America's national security interest, against the world's national security interests. And everyone in this room knows it. Everyone in this room knows it, including people that would protest by showing blood on their hands. They're literally the ones with the blood on their hands. They're supporting that. Now, for those who say there is no other organization to take this mission, no substitute, and that we must continue to fund UNRWA, the United Nations Relief Workers Agency, while the assessment is being made. While the assessment is being made. Well, I don't know how many years you need to make the assessment, ladies and gentlemen. I've made the assessment. The American people are tired of getting up early in the morning and going to work and trying to pay their bills and also be forced to pay for people that get money from UNRWA to slaughter Jews. They're tired of doing it, and they're sick of it. We had a vote on the 28th of September. I know because I offered the amendment. I offered the amendment to defund this terror-supporting organization. Came close. 213 to 218 we lost. We came close. If we had the vote today, I suspect it might be different because America can finally see what many of us here have seen for years and decades. Years and decades, as you have, Mr. Goldberg. This absolutely must end and must end now. Mr. Chairman, I think this highlights, and the information that we have highlights, the fact that we all believe in the best of people and humanity. And our heart cries out to anybody on either side of this equation and the tragedies that have happened. But we, the United States of America and the American people, cannot be complicit any longer. I yield.
Thank you, Mr. Perry. Chair now recognizes Ms. Manning.
Thank you, Chairman Mast and Chairman Smith, and thank you to all our witnesses for joining us today. I am outraged by reports that at least 12 of UNRWA's own employees participated in or helped plan the heinous October 7th terrorist attacks against Israel, attacks in which 1,200 innocent civilians were brutally murdered and hundreds were taken hostage, with many, including young women and children, who are still being held by Hamas. It is sickening to think that any teacher of children would participate in that attack, or that many other UNRWA employees might have links to Hamas or Islamic Jihad. I strongly support humanitarian assistance for the innocent Palestinians in Gaza, and what Hamas has done to the very people it was elected to govern is appalling. That's why what the administration, but it is simply intolerable to allow a UN agency to have employees who are members of Hamas, and that is why the administration was right to suspend funding to UNRWA pending investigation. Our international assistance can never be used to promote terrorism. Many of us have long demanded reform to UNRWA's fundamental problems, including its mission creep, the ongoing politicization of its mandate, its own employees' violations of UN principles of neutrality and tolerance, and the persistence of biased anti-Semitic content in textbooks used in UNRWA schools in both the West Bank and Gaza. In many UNRWA schools, teachers have literally been raising terrorists with the appalling anti-Semitic content in their textbooks. Given the serious, legitimate humanitarian needs as we look at the day after Gaza, I hope our witnesses can help us understand how we can go about overhauling UNRWA, because I just don't think we can tolerate what we have recently seen. And I'm concerned that what we have recently seen is just the tip of the iceberg with regard to UNRWA. Mr. Goldberg, according to its website, the UN High Commission on Refugees protects refugees and works with governments and partners to find long-term solutions so they can find a safe place to call home, and that includes integration into the host community or resettlement into integration in a third country, and helping them access livelihoods so they can live with greater independence and contribute to their communities. In other words, the UNHRC helps refugees build new lives. Does UNRWA do this?
No, ma'am. It has a mandate to keep people in refugee status indefinitely and raise them to internalize that as a vision that one day they will return to homes and destroy the modern Israel, push the Jews into the sea. It is core to the mission to keep Palestinians limited in their economic and political rights. In my view, it is anti-human rights as an organization.
And in the day after this conflict is resolved, if the international community were to establish a new mechanism to serve the same population in Gaza, how would or should its workforce and its mandate be different from UNRWA's current workforce and mandate?
It's a great question, ma'am, and that's actually where the focus of our attention should be. If we all can agree on the premise that UNRWA is done, and now we're moving on to what comes next, now we can actually have a policy discussion, which is very important. UN High Commissioner for Refugees can play a role. There are other places in the world where conflict breaks out, where we have IDPs. UNHCR moves in very quickly. By the way, they did that in Syria, where UNRWA was operating and UNRWA couldn't operate anymore. UNHCR came in and took over a lot of responsibilities. We have the World Food Program, we have UNICEF, we have other organizations, but also, if we get to a place where Hamas is finally out of control of Gaza, where we get to a place where we have reform in the Palestinian Authority, at some point we also have to talk about moving this out of a multilateral system into a bilateral aid program with true oversight, metrics for success. How are you moving people to economic success, political prosperity, openness, et cetera? If you're just looking at handing a check over to an organization that just keeps people in despair, you're going to get more people in despair. You're going to get the terrorism you don't want.
Thank you. I have many more questions, but unfortunately my time has expired.
Thank you, Ms. Manning. Chair now recognizes Mr. Mills.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think it's simple to say that over the 20-plus years that the United States has been involved in overseas conflict, whether that be the war in Iraq or the war in Afghanistan, that you can't simply defeat ideology through bombs and bullets. This is something that is taught. This is something that is trained. And that is why even after the Russians fell in Afghanistan, it was such a big element for us to want to fight towards education of our children, because it's very proven through many studies that children are not born with hate, they are taught hate. And so I agree with many of our panelists on the ideas that the first thing that we have to do is root out the hatred in these curriculums and textbooks that are actually intentionally looking at breeding the next generation of terrorists. The problem for me, however, is that many are trying to act as if the United States stops being a donor to UNRWA, that it simply ceases to exist. It's just not true. You've got Germany, EU, Sweden, Norway, Japan, France, Saudi Arabia, Switzerland, Turkey, Canada, Netherlands, et cetera, who are all donors into these programs. I think that it's simple to say that we all echo the same sympathies that Representative Perry mentioned by saying that it's not okay for any civilians of any type to lose their lives. That's what we're trying to prevent. But we certainly cannot continue to fund the very organizations that are responsible for these attacks. And UNRWA is directly responsible, as are many of these organizations, for the horrendous, horrific, and barbaric attack that occurred on October 7th. But I would also argue that this is systemic across the United Nations, which I have said should be replaced with the notion of being the useless nations. Because you had Resolution 2231, the nuclear JCPOA, that was set up to try and keep Iran from funding and continuing terrorism. And under General Secretary Ban Ki-moon and Gutierrez, we know of multiple violations of mid-range ballistic missiles and other types of terrorist activities that was taking place where they wouldn't do anything until President Trump came forward and removed us from these failed policies. So I think this is a deeper issue. You know, whether it's the 12 members who participated in the event itself, whether it's the 3,000 UNRWA teachers who are celebrating this massacre and yet they're screaming for more aid to try and develop peace, it's all a failure and a false premise. But I will tell you right now, $343 million, Ms. Rudman, is a lot of money. When you're $34 trillion in debt, when you have no economic growth strategy in the United States that enables us to actually ensure that we have opportunities for the American citizens in which we serve, and when we're continually being pulled back into these kinetic elements of warfare, whether it be in Iran, whether it be the Iraq and Afghan conflict, whether it be the Ukraine conflict, whether it be defending the 12% of global shipments through the Red Sea, the bottom line is that the time is now to start thinking about America. The time is now to start not looking at things as just business as usual across D.C. and the swamp. And so I'll tell you, I absolutely support with full heart the end of funding to UNRWA and their destabilizing role that they've played within the Middle East. I'm one of the members who actually went over to Israel recently. You know, when the attack took place on October 7th, I actually went over on October 11th and helped to rescue and evacuate 255 Americans, 96 by ground. I'm not sitting here having these 5-minute discussions for talking points so I can post on social media for clicks and likes. We have to have real effective change. And we have to acknowledge that Hamas is a terrorist organization. We have to acknowledge that Hezbollah is a terrorist organization under Hassan Nasrallah. We have to acknowledge that the Iranian-backed militias, whether it be through Qais Khazali or Hadi al-Amri or Muqtada al-Sadr or any of the ones who are continuing to try and make the 150-plus attacks on American soldiers, the 30-plus attacks that's happened in our shipping lanes, or the 3 brave heroes that just lost their life in the outpost in Tower 22. The 13 who lost their life on August 26, 2021, that many people want to forget in the botched withdrawals. Our domestic and foreign policy must change in America. It cannot be the decades and decades of failed policies that has either resulted in America training 8 of the 11 coup leaders in Africa, or whether it be funding organizations like UNRWA, who continues to support terroristic activities that resulted in many people losing their lives. I stand with Israel's rights to defend itself, and I stand with the American colleagues that are here who are willing to defund UNRWA and stop these terrorist organizations like Hamas from using our money to build the terrorist tunnels and continue these types of horrific attacks. With that, I stand back.
Thank you, Mr. Mills. Chair now recognizes Ms. Dean.
Thank you, Chairman Mast, and thank you, Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Crow, Ranking Member Wild, for holding this important hearing. Thank you to our witnesses for testifying and sharing your knowledge and expertise with us on this important matter. But let's remember, we're here for the purpose of oversight. We are here, I hope, for the purpose of solutions, not just whitewashing or blackwashing or whatever kind of washing entire structures until and unless they deserve it. The allegations of the UNRWA employee involvement in October 7th attack is deeply troubling. We can all agree upon that and warrants a thorough and independent review. I, too, have traveled to Israel since the war, 5 weeks into the war, visiting with Minister of Defense Gallant, visiting with our ambassador, visiting with the Prime Minister, visiting with hostage families. What Israel suffered is unspeakable. There are no words. What I want to do now is to say that is a truth that we must deal with, but we also have to deal with the war, the prosecution of the war, and how do we keep people from famine? A basic thing. Professor Rudman, I appreciated your 5 points, and in your 5th point, you indicated something that you had an idea. I'm sort of jumping to the end of the story, that you had an idea of something or some structure that could be put in place around UNRWA to address the gravest needs that the people of Palestine, that the Gazans are enduring, and how we fulfill that, both for Israel's security and our own national security interests. What were some of your ideas?
So I think there are any number of different structures going forward. The challenge is the immediate period and how we get through that. In other words, people need food now. You can't stand that. While I agree with some of the others on this panel that there are entities out there, those entities are not currently set up to be able to move forward and get food and water into the many, many innocent Palestinians in Gaza at this point. And so I think that two things need to happen in parallel. One, the investigations that the United States and others are calling for into how UNRWA, how this came to be with UNRWA. I know we have a variety of views on that here on this panel, but an investigation from outside of UNRWA. I think that the United States and Germany are two logical countries as the two biggest donors by some degree to UNRWA to carry out that kind of investigation. I think you could also go to former leaders of various UN entities. I think there's a leader of UNHCR who's quite familiar with what's been going on, with aspects on the ground from his prior experience. I would like to get his insights on how things could run, what we could set up and in which ways. But the challenge is you have an immediate issue.
Well, that's what I want to ask
address.
you. If I agree with the pause based on the reporting, but if the pause of funding to UNRWA is sustained, this abrupt pause is sustained, what is the outcome in Gaza?
If the funding does not resume, we have people who will be starving. And it's because it's not just us. There's a number of countries that have followed the United States lead on this. I understand that. But there is not enough funding going into UNRWA to be able to feed people. It's that simple.
On the question of educational materials, it seems to me that should be something that pressure could be brought to bear to make that happen. Do you see a path to that? And Mr. Sheff also, do you see a path to that? Yes, first, Professor.
Sure. Yes, I think there are people working on it. People on this panel have. I think there are people in other countries in the region, some of whom were named as well by Mr. Sheff, and there are people within Israel who have worked on changing their curriculum as well. So there's a route forward. That is not an UNRWA-specific challenge, though. That's a broader challenge on Palestinian Authority curriculum as well. I also know, you met with our ambassador, you know, he's very committed as well to addressing this. So there are routes forward to doing that. And I just put food and water as the more immediate pressure, but I understand the need to address this as well.
And Mr. Sheff, if you'll indulge me just a few more seconds, Mr. Sheff, what's the prospect of cleaning up the educational materials?
Sure. So very briefly then, it's a matter of will. It's as simple as that. This is not complicated. This is a matter of exchanging material in the textbooks, making sure that that is material of peace and tolerance. But I would argue, actually, if you'll allow me, that this is about UNRWA. And UNRWA made the choice to teach the Palestinian Authority's curriculum. It didn't have to. There are organizations around the world that do not teach the host nation curriculum because it is appalling. Yemen, the Houthi curriculum, just as an example. So they absolutely made that choice, and not only that, they created their own material to go with those textbooks, which is equally as bad. Is it possible to be done? Yes, really very simple indeed. Curricula are changed all over the world all the time. Is there a will? I think they really ought to be, don't you?
And to just conclude, I hope there is a will on this committee to get at the oversight, to get at the truth, and to get at solutions. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, ma'am.
Chair now recognizes Mr. Moran.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I get into some questions, I just want to make clear that, in my opinion, under no circumstances should U.S. taxpayers be on the hook to pay organizations that work contrary to the economic and national security interests of the United States. UNRWA seems to be doing just that, and that is highly unfortunate, and we need to take a continued close look at this. Most notably in connection with recent events in Israel, UNRWA has a history of perpetuating the problem through indoctrination of children to hate Jews, instigate violence, hate the West, and in latest reports, even hiring persons linked to the Hamas terrorist attack in Israel. It's totally unacceptable. Mr. Goldberg, I want to ask you a couple of questions in regard to that. I thought I understood Ms. Rudman to say that there's other organizations that exist, but none of them really are equipped to do this work that UNRWA is doing. Is that the case, or are there other private organizations outside of UN control that can do substantially similar items and complete the same mission that UNRWA purports to do now?
It is 100% false. How do I know that? This isn't the first time we've had a conflict in the world where we had to move quick funding for humanitarian support. The UN moves at our direction. UN agencies move at our direction and the money. Follow the money. Follow into conflict. We move very quickly when we want to set up relief for people in need when there is crisis in the world. We have done that for decades. There are organizations that exist. I have heard this argument now repeatedly from members of the committee. UNRWA is indispensable. What's the alternative? If we cut it off, we're going to just have horrific suffering and loss. Well, let me take that logical argument to the next level, because this is really important. Hamas runs the health ministry in Gaza. Hamas runs the utilities in Gaza. Hamas runs the Ministry of Tourism and Trade and Economy in Gaza. My goodness, we have no alternative to Hamas, I guess. Hamas should stay. Is that the logical conclusion? Would any of those members say, we want Hamas to stay in charge of Gaza? What's the alternative? No. So why would you make that case for the United Nations Hamas Relief and Works Agency?
I agree with you, Mr. Goldberg. In fact, I find it ironic that we're sitting here talking about supporting an organization that purports to support the plight of refugees when oftentimes they're the ones that are causing a lot of the suffering, or at least contributing to the cause of the suffering by supporting organizations like Hamas. And I noticed that when we talk about how UNRWA selects its employees, they do some background checks, but those checks don't include checks that would exclude Hamas-connected individuals. Is that true?
Correct. If you look at their statement and the agreement we have with UNRWA, they reference United Nations sanctions lists, not U.S. designated foreign terrorist organizations, and certainly not the U.S. intelligence community.
Yeah, and I think that I hope that all of us on this committee would agree that when we look at what happened on October the 7th and subsequent to that, and the plight of the refugees in this region, the cause, the proximate cause, the single cause of that is Hamas and the hatred behind Hamas's attacks. Would you agree with that as well?
Yes, sir.
So what's preventing the United States from redirecting the $300+ million that's presently going to UNRWA to another organization that has no ties to terrorism, no ties to Hamas, that could accomplish much of this same thing?
Political will.
That's what I thought. Wouldn't it be better if we actually had the political will to turn away from entities and organizations like UNRWA that embrace organizations like Hamas, and for the United States to say, no, there is a better, more strategic pathway that we can take, and that is to support organizations that can accomplish the mission and are strategically aligned with our friends and allies, and frankly, with just morality itself. Would you agree with that?
Yes, sir.
Are you aware of any circumstances prior to the most recent firing of 12 employees, any of you on the panel, in which UNRWA employees have been removed from their position after publicly or privately making anti-Semitic statements or giving support to Hamas? Is anybody aware of any of that? Go ahead, sir.
I'm not aware of a single case, and we've talked about hundreds, where we've talked about UNRWA teachers, school principals inciting to jihadi terrorism and the slaughter of Jews. I'm not aware of one case that UNRWA has communicated to us where they have fired that individual.
I do recall one case of a headmaster of an UNRWA school who was moonlighting as an Islamic Jihad commander. He was removed by an Israeli airstrike.
Well, that's one successful removal. Do any of you have any analysis on how the curriculum for these children, when UNRWA goes in to educate children in these areas, how's that curriculum developed? And one of my big questions here is there any part of the educational curriculum or programming that is overtly pro-American or pro-Israeli that teaches the benefits of democracy?
So, really important question. The curriculum is developed in Ramallah. It is developed by the Palestinian Authority. And, you had this moment, actually, between 2014 and 2016 when the Middle East, the MENA region, started looking at its school curricula. And that is when the United Arab Emirates, when Morocco, when other countries, and Egypt, other countries started making these decisions about the need to take out the hate, to take out the incitement, to create better societies of the future. And this has been rolled out over years. And now, as I said before, there are really exemplary school curricula in the MENA region. The Palestinian Authority decided to go entirely in the opposite direction. Between 2014 and 2016, it spent an enormous amount of time and effort and money creating a curriculum that was even worse than the one that came before. Any ideas of peacemaking were entirely removed, and what was left was a curriculum centered on jihad, centered on young people sacrificing themselves, centered on anti-Semitism, centered on hate. And that is a curriculum which UNRWA, a neutral United Nations organization, adopted as is, without changing a line, a jot, a tittle of the school curriculum. And just to make sure it got rammed home, they created their own supplementary material to go with it. So it comes from the Palestinian Authority. UNRWA adopted this, and I need to say this again. It didn't need to. It's supposed to be best practice to teach the host curriculum. There's no best practice about this curriculum, and organizations all over the world make sure that they do not teach hate. UNRWA made a choice, a decision to teach hate in its schools in Gaza and in the West Bank, and it is continuing to this day in the West Bank. We can stop this, and we need to stop this.
Thank you for your comments. I know my time's out. In conclusion, I'll just say UNRWA is not a new organization. It's not a fledgling organization. It's been around for a long time. These are not negligent mistakes. These are intentional acts. We need to walk away from this organization. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Moran. Now I recognize Mr. Schneider.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman. I want to thank both our chairs and the ranking members for holding this hearing. I want to thank the witnesses, not just for your testimony here today, but for your lifetime of work addressing this important issue. Mr. Noor, you noted in your opening remarks, and I agree, no one should be surprised about the recent report of UNRWA complicity with Hamas. We've been talking about this for years, if not decades. Recent reports estimate that more than 10% of UNRWA employees are affiliated with Hamas. But in fact, according to what I read in those reports, it's worse among men. It's estimated that 29% of the men working for UNRWA have affiliation with Hamas, and approximately half the employees have at least one family member affiliated with Hamas. And on October 7th, as we've just talked about today, at least 12 UNRWA employees crossed a new line, actively taking part in the horrific attack of Israeli communities near the Gaza border, brutally murdering more than 1,200, countless cases of torture, rape, mutilation. UNRWA's employees involved with taking hostages back, more than 250 people taken hostage. And let me pause here to note that there are 130 people still, more than 130 people still held in Gaza, now for more than 116 days. And the path to de-escalation starts with the immediate release of all these hostages. Yes. That's what we should be calling for, and we should be seeing that now. But Hamas has no interest in de-escalation or in peace. Hamas is a nihilistic, genocidal, terrorist organization founded on and dedicated to the principle of the destruction of Israel and the murder of Jews, which brings us back to the topic of UNRWA we are discussing today. No one who's been watching Gaza can be surprised by the reports. No one should be surprised by the extent. Yesterday's report showed that the pervasiveness of the integration of Hamas and Hamas ideology within the fabric of UNRWA. It's a systemic problem. We should not be asked to accept a Hamas-UNRWA link simply as the cost of ensuring humanitarian relief gets to Palestinian civilians. Mr. Goldberg, you said it in your opening remarks. There are other organizations. Ms. Redmond, you talked about the uniqueness of UNRWA. What I don't understand is that uniqueness. Why is there but one organization established by the UN that for 75 years has kept people in refugee camps, preventing them from rising up to a life and a standard of living that they see among their neighbors? Why is it that one organization is focused on this single point when there are another organization, UNHCR, who can address the rest of the world? I don't think we have to accept this. I don't think it's right that an organization charged with doing good should be allowed to be a cover for terrorism. And that's why we're talking today about what should happen to UNRWA. I think there's consensus, I hope there's consensus, that the services provided, the feeding of people who are hungry, providing good education to a population, you talked about it. How can we give an education that teaches the aspirations of democracy, of integration into a world society that sees success for all nations and not the destruction of perceived enemies? This is the handle, or this is the challenge. Now, we are in a crisis. There is a war. People need to get that humanitarian relief. We have to find another way. Again, Mr. Goldberg, you talked about it today. We've shown that we can do this in the past. We have to replace UNRWA with something else. There are organizations prepared to do that. My question as we talk about it, because it's not just food, it's desalination of water, it's handling of sewage, it's the provision of shelter, and obviously education. There are other organizations, but based on Mission Order 21, a lot of these organizations are prohibited for dealing with Hamas, having any contact with Hamas. The reality is Hamas is there. Can we get support from organizations like the World Food Program to bring more help, more flour and bread and food? Can we work with the Office of Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs to assist with emergency coordination? I support getting rid of UNRWA. I support the administration's decision to suspend it. But my question is, as I have 29 seconds left, are there ways to deal with this, to get around this prohibition of having any contact whatsoever with Hamas? I'll leave that with the last few seconds. Ms. Redmond?
So I think what you're talking about is the U.S. prohibition. And in fact, there has been assistance that has gone in for things like water and electricity, which is not controlled as directly as some others might have said. But each municipality in Gaza, the rules for the United States go to kind of who controls the municipality, and there have been times when we have had administrations that have waived the requirements. For example, there are very technical people who carry out what's needed to get clean water in and out, and they are employees of a municipality that might be controlled by Hamas. The United States has at times waived prohibitions to allow those people to be involved in us trying to get water in.
And I'm going to reclaim my time just because I'm over time. I want to give others a chance. But we can't let obstacles block us from replacing UNRWA and getting to a situation where we are taking care of the civilians in Gaza but not supporting terrorism. And with that, I yield back.
Chair now recognizing Mr. Hill.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, panel, for being with us today. Thank you for both our chairmen of our subcommittees for holding this important hearing. I'm grateful to you, and what a disgrace UNRWA has become. You know, I was thinking about the whole world that the UN attempts to provide care and service to. You know, think about it. It's a massive task. And yet UNRWA has a budget of about almost $1 billion, employs 30,000 people, 13,000 of which I think are in Gaza, or were. And then the Commission on Refugees, taking care of the whole rest of the world, has a budget of $10 billion and just 18,000 employees. Let that sink in. Mr. Goldberg, you know, what's wrong with this picture? Could the UN Commissioner on Refugees handle this work and just abandon, since all the countries are disgusted with that $806 million or close to $1 billion with UNRWA, why didn't this just get transferred to the UN Commission on Refugees? Let's pick a handful out of the 13,000 that are effective. What do you think?
That has been the obvious solution for decades, but for the United Nations inherent systemic structural bias against Israel, support for UNRWA's mission of trying to instigate incitement against Israel. That is the only reason it hasn't happened.
So you're charging that the UN itself is the most anti-Semitic organization on the planet? Is that what you're saying?
100% correct.
Yeah.
Documented by UN Watch and others. But I would say, Ms. Rudman said something before, and it's very, very much a flag. Don't go to ask UN High Commissioner of Refugees, is it okay? Would you like to do this? The UN Secretary General is already circling the wagons to defend UNRWA. If you ask the UN, what do you think? The UN, we know what they think. They hate Israel. We tell them what to do. Our taxpayer dollars lead the way, not the other way around.
Thank you.
Can
I thank you for that. I want to shift to Mr. Schiff. Thank you for testifying.
Thank you, sir.
I've spent a lot of time looking at curriculum, education curriculum, most of the time in Egypt. I'll say that's an area that I've spent quite a bit of time. And you see, you've reported in your testimony some successful curriculum changes in the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Morocco. Mr. Moran was just talking about this. And, you know, even though the Commission on Religious Freedom has done a particular study on the Egyptian education system, still we struggle with proper terminology and proper framing for Christianity and the Coptic Church, for example, in Egypt. How did you find the countries that have broken the code and found success? What was the key point on that you would share?
A really good question, sir, and I'll try and answer it very, very briefly because it's such a big subject. If I could, though, just refer back to the point you made before. UNRWA is, frankly, not even good at this distribution job. Last Saturday, they actually asked that there would be a stoppage of trucks going through Kerem Shalom because they couldn't cope with the volume. So let us not think that this is actually their area of expertise. It really isn't. In relation to curricula, countries change their curricula for their own reasons, not to make the United States or anybody else proud of them or happy for them, but because they want to create societies of the future which make sense to them. You know, for MBS, it is about Vision 2030. It is about a Saudi Arabia that is more open, that is able to trade with the world, that is less dependent on oil and gas. And there's no question that a curriculum which prepares young people in a tolerant, open, peaceful way will go a long way to a country which in 2030 will be more able to do that. The UAE, Mohammed bin Zayed, made exactly that determination in 2011 and drove a quite remarkable change because that is the UAE he wanted to see. And anybody who spent time in Dubai, in any other part of the UAE, can see how successful that has been. Egypt.
Well, I would hope then that leaders in those countries would help lead the change in these more reluctant countries, including, let me say, I'm a proud supporter of Christian education in the West Bank through the Catholic Church, and yet history starts at 600 AD, and I'm not sure that's the right way to teach history, so let me yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hill. Chair now recognizes Mr. McCormick.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll make this fast because I got a lot to go over. We've talked a lot today about the 12 UNRWA employees, but those 12 employees are just the tip of the iceberg when you talk about possibly thousands of employees loyal to Hamas and anti-Semitic and anti-American interests. Over the years, this organization that we spend about 28% of the UN's budget is supported by the United States, and yet this organization has thousands of allegations of child trafficking, rape, murder, theft, embezzlement, with almost no accountability. I was in Uganda in 1994 as part of Operation Restore Hope, watched UN leave and watched almost 1 million people be killed. And if you look at the UN's history and their involvement in foreign countries. Let me list some of them: Congo, Somalia, Rwanda, Libya, Angola, Sierra Leone, Sudan, Haiti, Afghanistan, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Yemen, Iraq, Iran, just to name a few. How's that been going? Mr. Noor, there have been hundreds of resolutions of the United Nations condemning Israel. How many have condemned the Palestinian administration?
I'm not aware.
The one that condemned, the one that was run by Hamas, by the way.
I'm not aware of any resolution condemning
Nor am I,
Palestine.
but there have been hundreds against Israel, usually in the double digits per year. This is the United Nations, by the way. The United Nations, that organization which we fund 28% of. I know that UNRWA oversees Gaza's educational system, and for years it's sectioned the textbooks used that have, quote, encouraged to sacrifice their blood to liberate Jerusalem, with terms such as, quote, jihad warriors, including the attempting to erase Israel's existence and legitimacy. I know that you, Mr. Noor, have been against the appointment and nomination of Mr. Pierre, along with 18,000 other folks. Can you tell me exactly why Mr. Karenbol should be opposed?
Thank you, Congressman. Look, the Red Cross on its own has failed to meet with any of the hostages that are being held in Gaza, and that is shameful. In addition, beyond their diplomatic failure, in their public statements, we've counted 10-to-1 their statements are in favor of the Hamas narrative and biased against Israel. The notion that they would now appoint Pierre Krahenbuhl, the former head of UNRWA, who was forced to resign in disgrace, is shocking, and we oppose it. He was forced to resign in 2019 in wake of a major corruption, abuse of power, and ethics scandal, which included allegations that he had a very inappropriate relationship with one of his staffers who was paid $200,000 a year, and the Swiss government paid for it. Several countries suspended funding in 2019 in wake of the scandal, including Switzerland, Belgium, and the Netherlands. And his response was to say he was cleared of the charges, he claimed in a Swiss TV broadcast. He said it was a conspiracy. The implication of this broadcast was that it was a conspiracy between the U.S., Israel, and the Swiss foreign minister to besmirch UNRWA. But the reality is that even people who like UNRWA said it's false, that he was not cleared of the charges. The UNRWA ethics inspector, Lex Tackenberg, and Professor Ricardo Bocco, both of them leading supporters of UNRWA, said Pierre Krahenbuhl was not cleared of the charges. So the notion that the Red Cross would appoint this person is shameful. And I just want to say, in closing, that the Swiss newspaper Le Temps, Louis Lama, wrote 3 parts in an investigation. He wrote that the allegations of corruption are all valid. There was terrible corruption in UNRWA, but no one wants to talk about it because it might help the U.S. and Israel in their criticisms.
And so this is
no one wants to talk about it.
I want to sum this up. We spend about $13 billion per year right now on the United Nations, the leading funder by far. And this is an organization that has tons of corruption, tons of appointees that are anti-American, anti-Semitic. I want to call not in just to question what we spend on UNRWA, but on the United Nations in general, a top-down review. I'm talking about all spending. I'm very much in favor of ceasing all spending until they get their stuff straight, until they prove they're not corrupt, until they prove they're not anti-American, anti-Semitic. If you want to help people out of trouble, whether you be in Gaza or Palestine or anywhere else in the world, how about we start with organizations that are not corrupt, not anti-Semitic, and not anti-American? That's a better investment. It is a time for a change. It is a time for a choice. And let's start there. With that, I yield.
Chair now recognizes Mr. Issa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Rudman, you had several things you wanted to answer, and no one's asked you a question in a while. So I'd like, with your distinguished career at the State Department has about a $70 billion budget. You controlled, in your time, about a $1.8 billion budget, plus or minus. So you're familiar with large budgets, you're familiar with development, and you're a specialist in the Middle East. Is that a fair reducing of your long career?
Thanks, I appreciate it. I was actually only at State for a couple of years, the State and AID role, which you're referencing.
Right.
But I spent a lot of time working on budgets. That's fair.
Right. But, you know, looking at your history, I want to ask you some questions because I'd like to touch on something which is the day after okay, we're not going to give UNRWA another penny during however long this kinetic conflict goes on in the region. And when we go to start up again on the people of Gaza, the 2 million people of Gaza, things are going to have to be different. So from your State Department time and your private sector time, is it fair to say that, and I'm going to ask everyone this question, is it fair to say that there are sources of people who can be skilled educators who can help teach the children of Gaza in a balanced way what the world is and could be?
Yes. There are sources of people, including many Palestinians in Gaza, if you didn't have Hamas as the de facto rulers.
Well, I'm going to agree to disagree on that group being able to do it unless they're supervised at a very close level by people who have a demonstrated history that would say they're not going to go down that road. I'm not going to disagree with you that in any program, and you've seen some of them, we generally have some local employees. As I like to say, I have no problem with someone carrying a bag of cement, in a construction project being a local. I do have a problem with UNRWA overseeing goods and services coming into Gaza that got used to produce weapons that were stored in their facilities. So I'm going to ask the same question, Mr. Goldberg. And for that matter, any other witness for a moment. You are critics of UNRWA, but you're also critics of everything that has been taught to a generation of people in Gaza. In a short way, isn't it fair to say that if America is going to take a leadership, there are two things we have to do. One is we have to find the supervisors for the teachers and the teachers who will teach the next generation of Palestinians other than hate. And two, that the United Nations has not historically demonstrated ability to be that NGO that can do that. Is there anyone that disagrees with those two assumptions, that the record of UN is poor and that we must change the teachers of the children of the next generation of Palestinians?
No disagreement.
Yeah, no,
okay.
No disagreement. And just to say, there are seriously skilled pedagogues in MENA who can be helpful. You need to change the textbooks, you need teacher guides, you need to train the teachers, you need accountability, you need transparency. It can be done.
And just quickly, the top funders, the people who are giving the money for UNRWA, it's an interesting who's who, with the United States being such a large one, followed by Germany. And in the top 6 is Japan. What's amazing to me is a vast amount of the funding comes from Germany and Japan. It comes from countries who themselves went from teaching hate to, in a generation, being leaders for freedom and democracy. Is that fair? And Ms. Rudman, I'd like your answer on that piece of history is well demonstrated, that we as Americans have led the proper training and emergence of democracy in the past, and Germany and Japan are good examples.
I think they are good examples. I would note as well that the United States provided tremendous assistance to help them in getting to where they needed to go.
But we did it, and this is my closing question. We did those conversions of the Italians, the Germans, the Japanese. We did it led by Americans, staffed by Americans and other allies, and then at a local level, we vetted and found people who would cooperate with us and be part of it. That was what, both in the European and in the MacArthur area, made the difference. Is that the model that we should be considering for the day after this conflict?
Yeah. So, yes, absolutely, and I think there can be involvement in many countries in that. I think Germans who I'm speaking to, utterly horrified about their efforts being turned into the horror show that education is. By the way, the Japanese are giving money specifically to scientific education. I wonder how they think about math being taught by adding up martyrs, about physics, Newton's second law being taught by telling young people to endanger themselves. So yes, their efforts are being made into a joke, frankly.
Ms. Rudman, is that, as a closing, is that something that all four of you can agree that that model and that approach should at least be given serious consideration by our State Department?
I would support it being given serious consideration. I prioritize a little bit differently the immediate day after, because I think getting basic needs into people, there are not buildings for people to be taught in, there are not buildings for people to live in.
And, Mr. Chairman, I think we not only agreed on what I asked to agree on, but I would agree with the gentlelady that, in fact, the day after will have to be comprehensive. We can't teach people to give up hate if we cannot help feed them and house them. And so I look forward to this committee, which has the lead role in that day after. And, Chairman, thank you for your oversight, and I yield back.
I thank the witness for the valuable testimony, members for their questions. Members of the subcommittee may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we will ask you to respond to those in writing. I now recognize Mr. Crow for any closing remarks that he may have.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you for convening this meeting, and to our witnesses today for the very robust discussion. I'm going to keep it short because we have votes that we have to run to, but the bottom line for me is I'm deeply troubled by the allegations against UNRWA, and believe that those allegations must be addressed, and that very well may take the form of disbanding and replacing it with a different entity. But I'm equally as deeply troubled by any action that would further deepen the catastrophic conditions on the ground for innocent civilians, right? So for me, the issue is very simple, right? How do we address these allegations in the challenges that have been well documented, but make sure that we continue a flow or an increase a flow of aid to the suffering Palestinians in Gaza. And I look forward to working with everybody to try to figure out what are the solutions to get us there. And we need to bridge this, right? Because there's a timeline challenge. If we cut off funding to UNRWA, I think there's a very real debate. And I frankly don't think that there are entities right now that can fill the exact services that are being provided by UNRWA. So how do we bridge that gap is the challenge to make sure that people that are starving now don't die. With that, I yield back.
Chair now recognizes Mr. Smith for a closing statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And without objection, testimony from Dr. Debbie Sofrin, who is the first child advocate, I should say, for the Wiesenthal Center. We made a part of the record. And I want to just point out for the record that decades ago, Dr. Sofrin, who's a pediatrician, brought to my attention some of the most horrific things that were happening by UNRWA, which just blew my mind in terms of the hatred that was being conveyed to these children. And again, you got to be taught. They're being taught, and they'll keep getting taught. You know, we and you, Mr. Goldberg, you made a very good point about how we know how to set up emergency situations for refugees. We've been doing it forever. And the United States takes a lead, not just in funding it, but doing it. I remember when the Kurds left and Operation Provide Comfort, they got onto the border of Turkey. Our military, in that case, especially from a humanitarian point of view, provided food, clothing, medicine, and saved the lives of so many people. There are ways to do it. Hamas is disgraced. So is its proxy or its identical twin, and that would be UNRWA. They have disqualified themselves. And if we can't, during this terrible time, when they have proven themselves beyond any reasonable doubt to be absolutely anti-Semitic, but even more than that, they have taught these kids to hate. That cycle will never be broken if we, in any way, shape, or form, countenance any further support for UNRWA. Let's find the alternative. Let's do it. Let's put our minds to it and our money in order to save lives and to save these children from child abuse.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. I now recognize myself for a closing statement. I want to start by a word of thanks for many. I want to start by thanking President Trump, #1, for being the first to have the stones to defund UNRWA. He went out there and he did it. He saw the writing on the wall and he went out there and did it. I want to thank the witnesses for their testimony today, which show to be that to have been a correct course of action. You all provided vital information, context, raised important questions about UNRWA, and UNRWA has a lot to answer for. We reached out to UNRWA's Commissioner General, Mr. Philippe Lazzarini, requesting that he appear before this committee and the American people. In his response, which I will introduce for the record, while declining to appear publicly, Mr. Lazzarini goes on to tell us a number of things. That UNRWA is committed to neutrality, he said, that UNRWA conducts quarterly integrated assessments of their installations and to ensure adherence to neutrality. I guess these assessments must have somehow missed the missiles, the weapons, the anti-Semitic textbooks in the schools, and the terrorist tunnels being built underneath them. He must have missed that 10 to 15% of the employees are tied to Hamas. The letter goes on to tell us that UNRWA has a zero-tolerance policy with regard to staff neutrality, and yet we know that at least 1,200 UNRWA staffers have direct ties to Hamas and other terrorist organizations, and at least 12 staffers who were directly involved in the October 7 attacks. My assessment today is that the administration will likely ignore the facts and go back to funding UNRWA at some point. And I say what was said here before. I'll repeat what was said in this hearing. Essentially, I'm going to say this. I'm going to paraphrase the way that I interpreted this. There are many here that are not here to defend UNRWA, but they will support continuing to give UNRWA the earnings, the dollars of the American people with no threshold for bad behavior. That can't be the course of action for Congress, for the administration, for America whatsoever. I can tell you that to expect moving forward, we will be introducing legislation to claw back any recent dollars that were sent to UNRWA. And in that, I thank again the witnesses for their testimony. Pursuant to committee rules, all members may have 5 legislative days to submit statements, questions, and extraneous materials for the record, subject to length limitations. And without objection, this committee stands adjourned.